This is Asian Insider and I'm Nirmal Ghosh. It is more than 100 days since Myanmar's army, the Tatmadaw, launched a coup d'etat against an elected government headed to all intents and purposes by State Councillor Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, currently again in detention. Now, since then, there have been non-stop protests and the military responded with a crackdown that has shocked even hardened observers with its brutality. It has shocked the international community, in fact. At least 769 people have been killed and nearly 3,700 detained in this ongoing crackdown. And to put things in perspective, since ASEAN on April the 24th declared a 5-point consensus on, among other things, the need to cease the violence, the regime has killed 33 people and arrested 454. A poet detained for interrogation turned up dead with his internal organs removed. Most recently, the regime called the ASEAN leaders' pleas for restraint and dialogue at that meeting suggestions and said it will consider them, but only when stability and law and order have been restored. So there are so many complexities here, but let's focus for starters on the economy. The UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme, has warned in a report only days ago that more than 83% of households reported a drop in income since the start of 2020. In the UNDP's worst case scenario, 48.2% of the population, that's about 26 million people, could be living in poverty by 2022, compared with 24.8% in 2017. Joining me on Asian Insider today is Puint Thun, who is based in Seattle. Puint is non-resident fellow at Harvard's Ash Center's Myanmar program and has worked closely at the highest levels of Myanmar's former government on telecom reform and mobile financial services policy. And she has trained parliamentarians in both the houses. And from Bangkok, I'm pleased to have Richard Horsey back. Richard is a former senior UN official in Myanmar and is currently an independent analyst and senior advisor on Myanmar at the International Crisis Group. Puint, may I start with you? First of all, thank you very much, both of you, for spending time, for giving us your time today. So, Puint, may I start with you?
You were
telling me about the banking collapse in Myanmar earlier. That's one critical aspect. Another is agriculture, and these two things are intertwined. Please tell me, what is the impact out there on the people?
Myanmar is, since the coup, the country has just been in this free fall as a result of the military coup. When the military shut off the internet, access to the internet, they had effectively cut off ability for mobile financial services industry to exist. And this is the industry that has really brought so much of the access to finance for people outside of the urban areas. And once the access to telecommunications have been cut off and mobile financial services are unable to be used, everyone inside Myanmar reverted back to the cash-based economy. And Myanmar has always been very much a cash-based economy, but after the coup and with the new telecommunication infrastructure, it's even more become dependent on the cash. And as a result of the announcement by Jysk and Devrient from Germany, the Central Bank of Myanmar effectively have no way of printing any paper currency. So without additional fiat currency that the central bank have access to, the banks have extreme shortage of paper currency. And this is part of the reason why you are seeing limitations from the private banks on the limitations on how much people can withdraw money. There's limitations coming up, and there's long lines at the ATMs, long line at the banks. People are risking their lives to get a bank token to be able to withdraw money. Recently, I heard that there were several people in Mon State who was arrested overnight because they were waiting out. They were waiting for at the bank the night before the tokens are issued. When the banks issue tokens at 9 a.m., these individuals are standing in line at the bank the night before even though there is curfew that stops them from being able to be outside, people literally are risking their lives, risking getting arrested just to be able to withdraw cash. So that with this extreme cash scarcity, and people are trying to get as much cash out from their bank account as possible, and the currency is in the free fall at the moment. So we expect the banking sector collapse to really impact everyone across the country, across the board. I mean, if we were to look at the people, the population that is going to be impacted most, we can look at one very important group of people who are farmers. And right now is actually the beginning of the start of the rainy season. This is the start of the growing season for the farmers to be able to get their agriculture loan. Normally around this time is when farmers get access to finance, a loan from the Myanmar Agriculture and Development Bank, so that they can buy seed, so that they can buy fertilizer and enough funds for them to be able to farm for this coming year ahead. And with this banking collapse and banking sector shot in free fall, this impact is going to be massive for the agriculture sector as well. I mean, the impact is going to be massive for everyone across the board, but I am especially concerned for the impact on the agriculture sector and its consequences for the next years as well.
It's a grim situation. Now, Richard, about a month ago, you told the UN Security Council meeting Myanmar stands at the brink of state failure, of state collapse. So just for the record, the junta says it is fighting rogue elements of ethnic armies and all parties remain committed to the ceasefire agreements they signed. It has blamed a spate of urban bombings on Aung San Suu Kyi's ousted government and a recently formed national unity government, which is basically a coalition of anti-military groups, says the junta orchestrated the bombings as a pretext to crush its opponents. And there have also been clashes between the Tatmadaw and the Kachin and the Karen armies, to name just two of them. And the NUG, the National Unity Government, is also trying to raise a federal army. So what is the outlook on the civil war front? Are we going to see a full-blown civil war expand and engulf perhaps the entire country the way things are going?
Right. It's great to be back on Asian Insider again, Nimal. I think that's a really important question. Obviously, Myanmar has been in a complex civil war for 7 decades. So fighting is not new. But what we've seen since the coup is the risk that the country will tip into a new level of violence, not only in areas which have seen armed conflict in previous years and decades, but also in new areas, including the center of the country. Because there's only really 3 scenarios here. One is that the military is successful in imposing its will on the country and completing its coup. That is going to be very difficult. It's facing an enormous amount of opposition, very strong and determined opposition. The other is that the revolution is successful in unseating the Tatmadaw, the military, and installing a democratic government. That is going to be extremely difficult given the level of violence that the military is willing to resort to and its determination to hang on. So that leaves a third scenario where neither the military nor the resistance is successful. And Myanmar gets caught in a multi-year long tussle between the two. And the fallout from that, we've heard from Quint what the economic fallout could be, very catastrophic, but also in terms of conflict. This is a battle which is being waged, not only in the remote borderlands of Myanmar, but also in towns and cities across the country. And if the government is unable to deliver services, is unable to keep the country somehow functioning, health, education, food security, all of those things are imperiled, and the country could be facing a really grave situation going forward.
Quint, what does Myanmar need right now in terms of humanitarian aid? ASEAN was talking about humanitarian aid. I don't know what's happening on that front. But should there also be a wider aid effort? Should the international community be prepared in the months ahead to ramp up aid significantly? We've already seen some refugees. We'll probably see more. And the way things are going, it's going to need a lot more than just ASEAN, right?
Absolutely. That's a great question, Nirmal. The international community, especially the World Food Program, should be prepared for the emergency food aid. And the thing is, actually, the international community and the UN has been supporting these emergency food aid for the internally displaced people up in Kachin State, Northern Shan State, and Rakhine State for the last decade, nearly the last decade. And this is going to expand out to the rest of the country. And as you had mentioned earlier, the UN numbers, the UNDP is speculating that up to nearly half of the population of Myanmar will be living below poverty lines by 2022. So I think with that in mind, the World Food Program should really be ramping up and preparing and thinking about ways of delivering emergency food aid so that it's not allowing the military to use the World Food Program's donation to empower themselves in the position of power. I think the World Food Program need to be really thinking about figuring out ways to use mobile financial services to really deliver the emergency food aid as well, to make sure that there is no leakage. And Myanmar has had many decades of entrenched corruption, especially by the General Administration Department, which is under the Ministry of Home Affairs, which has just recently moved back into Ministry of Home Affairs. And there has been long tradition of leakage and people who use these emergency food disbursement to enrich themselves, that I think World Food Program need to be really thinking about ways of eliminating leakage and delivering these emergency food aid directly into the people's hand through the pervasive mobile phones that's in every citizen's hands in Myanmar.
Okay, now Richard, at a panel just the other day, you were mentioning that as the licit economy sinks, so the illicit economy rises. And here we have parts of Myanmar, specifically the north, that already have thriving illicit economies. The so-called Golden Triangle is the meth factory of the entire Asia Pacific. And we have powerful armed groups, armed ethnic groups that control a lot of these areas. We do know that transnational organized crime thrives in gray areas, in ungoverned spaces. This looks likely to get worse again, as almost half the population sinks back into poverty. As Puint was saying, there's long been corruption that can only get worse. So we're looking at an expansion of these risks ahead, right? The trafficking in drugs, trafficking in people as well, right?
Yes, I'm very worried about this. I think as the economic crisis deepens and bites, I think illicit economic actors, transnational criminal organizations who are already well entrenched in parts of Myanmar will get stronger, will capitalize on this. And I'm worried that we could see larger parts of Myanmar being captured by these criminal economic agendas. That's very bad for these areas, it's bad for the country, but it's also bad for a better future for Myanmar, because once these very powerful, very rich criminal networks have managed to work out how to operate in the new normal, they will be very resistant to any attempts to improve the situation and bring it back to better governance and a more normal situation. And so it won't just be the military that will have to be dislodged. It will also have to be these criminal networks that will step up their activities in the country, and that will be a very, very difficult battle for any government.
And going back to your remark just the other day about a failed state, about the risk of being a failed state, at what point does one say that a country, or Myanmar in this case, is a failed state, and then what? What happens then?
This is a difficult question, because in many ways parts of Myanmar have experienced state failure for years or decades. Areas where normal governance does not exist, areas where the state is incapable of delivering any kind of services, including law and order, areas which have been de facto governed by different non-state actors. I think the risk and the worry is that that kind of state failure spreads from particular contained parts of the country to the center. And once you have the heartland of the country failing in that way, it'll be very hard, for the country to kind of muddle through and for people to survive. And we could really see a really catastrophic situation, not just in terms of economic problems, but also in terms of security for people. And I think there's, we've seen around the world what happens when states fail in that way. And it is possible that Myanmar can also go down that path, and that would be a very, very serious development for the country, for its neighbors, and for the wider region.
Certainly what happens in Myanmar doesn't stay in Myanmar. We've seen that. Puent, I'll give you the last word. What is your take on the situation going forward? What would your appeal be in terms of Myanmar?
I would appeal to the neighboring countries to really think about that, yes, the problems in Myanmar are not going to be contained. Let's not forget that this is a COVID era, and the military seems to be taking actions that, without taking into consideration of human lives, whether against protesters or things even like forcing all the teachers and students, young students, to come back to school. And forcing open the schools with unvaccinated students just seems like spells a recipe for COVID contagion. Like, it just seems like there is lack of consideration for human lives in every decision that they're making. The decision that the military made around so many things really perplexes many people who have, they have really undone the last decade's progress that we've made in poverty alleviation in the last 100 days alone. And it has been very heartbreaking for those of us who are in the fields of working on poverty alleviation. And if we were to look at, the military generals and the elite, they may be millionaires and billionaires with private bank accounts in Singapore to store their stashes. But if we look at the pay scale of the enlisted man, the private foot soldiers in Myanmar earns 160,000 kyat per month, which is less than $100 per month in today's exchange rate. So these foot soldiers, their families are going to be suffering from this economic downturn, all these impact. They're going to be experiencing and feeling exact same impact as the rest of the citizens. They're not going to be immune to these economic shocks coming in.
Very hard to see this gigantic reversal. Puent Thun, Richard Horsey, thank you very much for being on Asian Insider today. All the best and take care out there. Very regrettably, we are looking at a bleak situation in Myanmar, which is only likely to get worse. Remember that the UNDP defines poverty in Myanmar as $1 a day. For Asian Insider, I'm Nirmal Ghosh.